What I would like to do in the allotted time that I have, which Joshua said maybe 40 minutes or so, more or less, is to talk about comparative theology as a field, comparative theology as I do it, which is a kind of interreligious learning. And I'll say at the end that it's a kind of interreligious learning that I think fosters two-way conversations. So I think it opens up a space in which not only do Christians study other traditions, but at least in theory, and I think also in practice, Hindus and Buddhists and other traditions can find ways to study the Christian on this ground. And I hope that you will engage truly in conversation, raise some good questions, and see where we go with this. The first thing I'd say, and maybe it's no, it's not obvious. I'm Catholic. I'm Roman Catholic, and work in the post-Vatican II Catholic Church. So I'm old enough that I learned Latin as an altar boy, and young enough that after 1 year of Latin as an altar boy, it was put out. So it was a time of transition after Vatican II, and I entered the Jesuit order to become a Jesuit in 1968. And so my formation and training as a Jesuit was all in the post-Vatican II church. And it's impossible to underestimate or overestimate the importance of the changes in the church for the formation of religious, the study of philosophy, the study of theology, in that kind of very somewhat chaotic but certainly open period of the 1970s and into the 80s, when I was studying my philosophy and theology and so on. And I think while there is a long tradition, and I need not speak to you on this because you know it very well, I'm sure, of Christian engagement with other religious traditions, and that itself is grounded in the biblical engagement, both in the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, with other traditions, other religions. Nonetheless, since Vatican II, I think the Roman Catholic take on the study of other religions has taken a decisively creative turn. Some people lament it. Many of us like it and think it was very good. The post-Vatican II church, the roots for many of us, even though one has to take the entire council into account, the document, the famous little declaration at the end of the council, Nostra Aetate, in our times, in our day, was certainly the formative document. As you know, that document was not originally conceived of as for the sake of openness to the world religions, but rather grew out of a need that Pope John and his colleagues perceived need to say something to rectify and begin to repent for the terrible history of Jewish-Christian relations. And out of that concern and the desire to engage Judaism in a new way, there was also, by ripple effect, you might say, the need to say something about Catholic-Muslim relations. And because of that, the bishops in Asia were saying, well, then you've got to say something about Hinduism and Buddhism and the traditions of Africa and so on. So it all began to expand and open up. It was one of the very last documents to be passed and accepted at the council. I've talked to various people who were around Rome at the time of the council, and particularly Thomas Weinandy, a different Thomas, who was instrumental in helping to draft the document as a very young seminarian. And it was not necessarily going to pass. It was a document that was borderline, and some of the bishops said, we don't have time for this, let's leave it out, we can deal with it after the council is over. I won't talk about the passages about Jewish-Christian relations or Islam and Christianity unless you ask questions later. But for me, as a young Jesuit, young theologian, the passages that mattered most were about Hinduism and Buddhism. And in particular, the famous passage in paragraph 2, which I'll read to you, the Catholic Church rejects nothing of the things that are true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere attentiveness those ways of conduct in life, those precepts and teachings, which though differing in many aspects from the ones she holds and sets forth, nonetheless, by no means rarely, reflect the radiance of that truth which enlightens all people. Truly, she proclaims and must ever proclaim Christ, the way, the truth, and the life, in whom humans may find the fullness of religious life, in whom God has reconciled all things to himself. So this passage, which can be read in various ways, there are all kinds of subtle points in there, stood out in the 1970s and 80s, and I think thereon after, for the church's desire to affirm and acknowledge all that is true and holy in other religious traditions. That even if there are differences from those of Christians and Catholics, nonetheless, these things can be honored. Why? Because Christ, who is the light, radiates out of these traditions as well. Now, much ink has been spelt in the last 50 years. What does that mean? How does that radiance take place? How is Christ present in these traditions? But for me, as a young Jesuit, it opened the door saying, whatever is good and true, whatever is good and holy, go and find out. Look for it. See what you can find. By contrast, and this again, I'm sure many of you know this document better than I, Ad Gentes, the missionary document of the church, which came out actually after Nostra Aetate in the very last days of the council, has a different kind of language, whereas Nostra Aetate is this, whatever is good and true, we affirm it, it radiates the presence of Christ, we look to honor and work with people of good faith in these traditions. Ad Gentes, the missionary document, says, whatever truth and grace is to be found among the religions is a sort of secret presence of God. He frees from all taint of evil. He restores it to Christ its maker, who overthrows the devil's domain and wards off the manifold malice of vice. Now, this could be interpreted as in keeping, and church leaders certainly want to interpret these documents together, not in contrast. But this language of taint of evil, needing to be restored, overthrowing the devil's domain, warding off the manifold vice of malice of vice, is not present in Nostra Aetate. It's a different tone to that document. It continues, Ad Gentes, whatever good is to be found, what is found to be sown in the hearts and minds of men, in the rites and cultures peculiar to various peoples, is not only not lost, but is healed, uplifted, and perfected for the glory of God, the shame of the devil, and the bliss of men or human beings. And I think there's a certain caution that you can see even in the older document, Lumen Gentium of the Church at Vatican II, about not wanting to overdo the affirming of the good in the other traditions. Whereas Nostra Aetate is the one that whatever is good and true, we affirm it, we embrace it, we welcome it. Some people have said, well, that's because Nostra Aetate was meant to be read by non-Christians, and the other ones were meant for inside the church. But that kind of dual language, particularly today, breaks down very quickly. You can't be saying one thing in public to them and one thing in public to us as if people are not going to read both. The effect, though, of this, and all these points we can come back to, is that for me, in the 1970s, I think it was kind of the zeitgeist for many a seminarian, many a theologian, was the sense that our task is to go and seek what we can learn from other religious traditions and find what is good there and learn from it and bring it back into the church. This is really the basis on which the Jesuit superiors that I was responsible to in the 70s allowed me, after my BA philosophy studies, to go to Kathmandu for 2 years, where I taught school, because I wanted to be in a non-Christian culture. I wanted to see what another part of the world was like. All the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist, and without knowing anything academically about those religions, it was like FaceTime, immediate contact with these boys, with their parents, going to Pashupati Temple for Shivaratri, going to some of the Buddhist festivals in town and so on, learning on the ground about the other traditions, setting up a puja room in the school, which had never been done before, for worship by Hindus and Buddhists. The door was open. And when I was ordained a priest in 1978, I requested not to study theology for a PhD, but to go to the University of Chicago in the South Asia program in order to learn the languages, Sanskrit, Tamil, that I could work firsthand on the texts of Hinduism, arguing that while we certainly needed well-trained Catholic theologians grounded in tradition, my 4 years of theological study as a Jesuit was enough for me. And what I needed to do was learn the other in some depth. And that began the great kind of exploration of studying as much as possible, even today, what's going on in Hinduism, how I can learn from Hindu traditions, and then thinking, kind of relying on the fact that I at least think I have good Catholic instincts, what resonates with, what seems interesting from a Catholic viewpoint in the other. So that dynamic continued when I got to Boston College to teach in 1984. The big Jesuit university in Boston, the theology department, which has a doctoral program. In those days, a joint program with Andover Newton School of Theology, a sort of an ecumenical program. Some of the senior professors in the department announced to me that when I showed up that, well, you're not a theologian, you're not doing theology because you're studying non-Christian traditions. And to be a Christian theologian is to study the revelation and the teachings of the church and tradition with a capital T. And so really, you're not a theologian. You can teach the undergraduates, but you can't teach our grad students. Now, as a junior professor, usually you would be intimidated, but I was a Jesuit, so I could get away with it. So I started pushing back and arguing, you're calling me something, what they meant was less than a theologian. You're saying, well, you're a comparative religion person like those people at Harvard across the river. And I said, no, I'm a comparativist, but I'm a theologian. So I thought I was coining a new term, comparative theologian, in order to kind of claim my space in the doctoral program. And only after some time did I learn that this actually term has a long history. I'm leaving a copy here, in case anyone hasn't seen it, my book, Comparative Theology from 2010. But in the second chapter, I talk about the history of this term, used in Latin as early as 1699, and in English in 1700, a fellow named James Garden wrote a book called Comparative Theology, or Theologia Comparativa, which was talking about Protestants' need to move from an absolute theology to a comparative theology, where instead of always fighting about their differences, different kinds of Christian communities can learn from one another about what they have in common. In 19th century, Max Muller, other scholars began to call their work comparative theology, as well as comparative religion, and there were even books in the late 19th century called comparative theology. So what I thought I was doing of inventing a field was actually a long history, and I certainly now admit readily that it's part of a longer history. But the spirit of what I was trying to do was to say, to do this back and forth process of studying the other in some depth, learning from the texts, the rituals, the images, the practices of another religious tradition, without at first worrying too much about the why and the wherefore, or what the doctrines are, or what the stumbling points are, or how you can deal with this contradiction or that contradiction, dealing with it all by discovery. And any of you, I'm sure many of you do, do firsthand work on primary texts, that the arduous work of learning the language and reading and translating texts that haven't been translated is a very formative pedagogical experience. You learn a lot just by doing this. And for me, it's always been the learning experience of reading texts and commentaries in Hindu tradition kept opening new horizons. That again, I would look then for ways to say, well, what does this mean? Not simply anymore to talk about Christian and Hindu or Catholic and Hindu, but a 13th century commentary on an 8th century text talking about grace can raise very particular questions for Christian theologians that are well beyond and deeper, I think, than the general questions. Putting it this way raises one other point that I think I should mention, that my undergraduate training, we all had to do philosophy as Jesuits, but also I was a classics major. I'm old enough again that in high school we all had to do 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, for which I thank them endlessly. It was a great start to do that in high school. But basically a text-loving person, a literature-loving person, and the love of reading the text, finding things in the text. Some people are obviously much more philosophical, much more looking for the concepts for comparison. But my instinct in anything I do is really to read the text, appreciate the language, the literary form, and then go from there. And so much of what I say about comparative theology comes out of my disposition to be a reader rather than a theoretical thinker. And some of you may have a different approach, or you may have a more historical approach that I think could raise different kinds of questions. Against this background, I think it then becomes clear that I want to talk about comparative theology as a kind of interreligious learning that has its own particular dynamics. On the one hand, I'd say that interreligious dialogue or interreligious learning in general is a larger category, that the possibility of exchange with people need not be by reading text together. It would be disastrous, I think, to reduce interreligious dialogue to the kind of elite practice of scholars and traditions talking to one another. And there are many, many ways that dialogue can take place. But within the frame of dialogue, comparative theology is a true way of interreligious learning. Secondly, I really am serious about the fact that it's theology. Now, this is something you may want to raise questions about too. What does it mean that it's theology? What do you mean by theology? And I've gotten quite far in life by saying, well, we have the standard definition in Christian tradition, perhaps traceable to St. Anselm, faith-seeking understanding. And that in some ways, if there is a definition of theology that talks about being grounded in faith, committed to understanding, and in the process of seeking, if that's acceptable for other fields of theology, including ecclesiology or Christology or Trinity or whatever, comparative theology can be theology in that sense. You begin somewhere, you have a faith grounding in a tradition, but then you're seeking to understand your own tradition through the process of seeking first to understand another tradition and the back and forth process. So while I realize that there are more narrow definitions of theology, such as based only in biblical revelation, that might exclude this kind of comparative work, my understanding of theology is that the word understood in this fashion opened the door to a wider kind of understanding. So it's a kind of theology, and I think we shouldn't hold comparative theology to higher standards than other kinds of theology. Since there are many kinds of theology, this is one of them. I hope it's clear, even from what I've said already, that I would distinguish it from comparative religion or the general field of the study of religions, which I think are very important fields. I have nothing against the history of religions as a discipline, the study of religion, comparative religion. Some of my predecessors at the center at Harvard, most notably Wilfred Cantwell Smith, were great figures in the history of religions, comparative study of religion, and Smith would be one who would also sometimes use the word theology toward a world theology and so on. But the idea that the explicitness of the commitment and bringing the groundedness in a tradition into the work of comparative study, making it explicit and not simply implicit, is part of what I mean by comparative theology. So I think a person who does comparative religious work or the history of religions could well be extremely committed, devout Christian or Muslim or Hindu, whatever. It doesn't say anything about the personal commitment, but my understanding of the field often is, well, that's either deep background or not terribly relevant for the work of doing the comparative or historical study. Whereas I think for a theologian, and I would say for a comparative theologian, it's more upfront. You bring who you are and why you're doing it into the work. So most of my books and in my teaching at Boston College first and now at Harvard, I'm always fairly explicit with my students and then with my readers that I've studied Hinduism for over 40 years, I'll say, so it's a big chunk of my life, but I'm not a neutral person, I'm not a Hindu, and I write from a Catholic Christian perspective. And that readers should, caveat emptor, you should beware and not say this is suddenly he's channeling the voice of Hindus or something like that, but that my dispositions as a Christian affect how I read, the questions I'm asking affect how I read, and that even though I'm reading primary texts with their commentaries deep in Hindu tradition, I'm not saying that I read them exactly the way insiders to the tradition do. So although it has some overlap with study of religion, comparative religion, it's not the same thing. My study at Chicago was in the South Asia department, kind of Indology. And I would say in Indology or Middle Eastern studies or Sinology and so on, you should not make a fool of yourself in front of the experts in the areas. So while I don't see my work as primarily as a contribution to Sanskrit literature or understanding of Sanskrit, if I can't even translate the Sanskrit, then I'm in deep trouble. If I totally miss the century or are missing the influences on the text, then it leads to poor theology as well as poor Indology. But it's not Indology. It's not South Asian studies. It's theology. I hope it's also will become clear, and we can talk about this, that my work is not the theology of religions. And I realize this is a larger field that is often more understood, appreciated, and maybe more central and not unrelated to missiology and the sense of world Christian mission. My understanding of theology of religions is that based on Christian sources, biblical sources, an effort to see what room there is in Christian tradition for what kinds of judgments on other traditions, what kind of views towards salvation available or not through those traditions, what kind of estimate about how God might be working in those traditions or not. And that this field across all Christian traditions is extremely important. But when I was getting started, what struck me is that most theologians of religions, and I'm thinking again, I don't know if you'd call Karl Barth a theologian of religions, but there's obviously sections of his dogmatics that pertain to this. But Catholic figures like Karl Rahner, Paul Nitter, Jacques Dupuy, Mark Heim in the Baptist, American Baptist tradition, are doing, for the most part, reading Christian sources and talking to and arguing with other Christian theologians about the relative openness or not of Christian tradition to positive views of the other. And what struck me early on is that, in a sense, maybe with an exception for Judaism early on as being different, it didn't really matter whether you were talking about Hinduism or Buddhism or Taoism or Native American. It was really positioning within Christian tradition about the other, and then you kind of put the other in afterwards. And that you don't actually have to know anything about Buddhism or Hinduism to do theology of religions. And it struck me somewhat as wrong, but also as something I didn't want to do. But I wanted rather my work to be generated out of the study of the other and the questions that arise. So this is something we could talk about, the relation between these two fields. And people often push me on the level of, why are you doing it? What is your theology of religions? What do you think Hinduism is or Buddhism is such that you would do this? And I say those are great questions, and I'll get to them eventually. But in the short run, have you ever read this text? Have you ever learned from this commentary? And this is the thing I can bring into the discussion rather than trying to repeat the work that other people are doing. So it's different from theology of religions, and therefore I would like to think without prejudice to concerns about evangelization, the mission of the church in global theology, and so on. This is something that can be done whether you're very conservative or very liberal or somewhere in between. That the ability to learn from the other in some depth doesn't seem to be foreclosed by one's disposition, either culturally or theologically. So I see no reason why somebody can't take up, for instance, there's a volume coming out now of essays on Karl Barth and the study of other religions. I think Joshua has done work in this field. There's no reason why one couldn't be a Barthian and take up what Barth did in 1-2 about Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and say, I'm going to do that differently and better by actually studying the other tradition, learning from it in more depth, even if one is a Barthian or if one is like a Rahnerian or whatever. But I think comparative theology, therefore, doesn't depend on a certain theological disposition, even if most people who do it tend to be fairly, you might say, open to learning from the other. Maybe that disposition is required. So against that background, just give just a couple of things about work I've done in the past, and then mention a book that I'm working on right now, and then I will be done. And then we can, I have a respondent, and we can talk about where we go from there. But so the work I've done over the years, and Joshua was kind enough to mention some of my books at the beginning, has almost always begun by picking something in the Hindu traditions, that's where I work, studying the text at great length, reading commentaries, because I like to work on texts that have commentaries, not texts that it's just me in the text, reading them, translating them, fussing over them, and then saying, so what? And trying to bring it into some kind of conversation. So the book in 1993, which was really my maybe first book in comparative theology, called Theology After Vedanta, was a reading of certain texts of Shankara, the great Hindu theologian, and commentators on Shankara in the non-dualist Vedanta tradition. Reading him, saying that how do we read this as a pedagogical teaching tradition that then disposes us to go back to well-known figures in Catholic tradition like Thomas Aquinas and read him as his Summa as like a teaching tradition that can now be read slightly differently because one has been reading Shankara. So rather than saying, is non-dualism compatible with Catholic doctrine as in the Summa, what is the pedagogy and way of writing and teaching of Shankara that makes us both appreciate and then maybe question in certain places how Aquinas and commentators on Aquinas read. So that book, I did a follow-up book, Seeing Through Text, in 1996, in which I used my other expertise in Tamil, South Indian devotional literature, reading this beautiful, beautiful Tamil poetry of the Alvars, the Vaishnava saints, a heartfelt devotion with its commentaries, and saying, well, this raises another question because it raises issues of piety, devotion, religious experience. How does one bring that into thinking within the Christian tradition? Over the years since then, I've done various projects along the way. I'll just mention a couple. One was the book in 2001 called Hindu God, Christian God, that Oxford published. And there I tried to step back from the reading of the text to make an argument, echoing what I said before, that even if you are very conservative or cautious about other religions, you can still do this. So the book had 4 major chapters on the existence of God, the true name of God, incarnation, and revelation. And I tried to pick kind of heavy-duty, solid, recent theologians as exemplars in each chapter. So for existence of God, Richard Swinburne, who then was still at Oxford. For the naming of God, Hans Urs von Balthasar. For incarnation, Karl Rahner. And for revelation, Karl Barth. So these are not lightweight figures. These are not ones you can say these are just liberals who are open to anything, but rather solid figures talking about how they problematize in their work these topics, and then go back to Hindu classics and argue and show, as best I could, that similar and relevant arguments are taking place in those traditions too. Vedanta, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and so on. And that intellectually, one should be open to what these theological peers in the other tradition are saying. So faith-wise, one may have the disposition to say, we have the revelation, what is right and true has been given to us. But intellectually, if you're pondering, how can we talk rationally about God's existence? Or what does it mean that God took on human flesh? It seems imprudent or unnecessary to say, but I can't learn anything from Indian intellectuals on this. So in each case, I try to show, even if you come from a solidly Christian set of concerns, you still can learn from the other. Very different was the book that came out a couple of years ago, His Hiding Place is Darkness, a theopoetics of divine absence, where trying to get to the other end of the spectrum, from the rational side to the more affective, emotional, you might say pious, intensely engaged side of the tradition, because I often feel that people think if you do comparative work, you lose your soul, or your heart dries up, or you no longer have the piety of your tradition. So reading the Song of Songs in Latin and English, I don't know Hebrew, sadly, with Bernard of Clairvaux and his successors, Gilbert of Hoyland and John of Ford. Between the three of them, they did about 250 sermons on the whole Song of Songs. How did they read and teach the Song of Songs with particular emphasis on this theme of the beloved who comes and goes unpredictably? And what do they make of that, and what does it tell us about us and about God? Reading that with medieval Hindu poetry of the South Indian saints, a particular text called Tiruvayamori, or the Holy Word of Mouth, with its commentaries on the absence of the beloved, the intense longing for the beloved, and how do those commentators make sense of how the good and gracious God could suddenly withdraw and be hiding. And arguing that one can get engaged and should be able to get engaged in the tradition of Bernard's reading of the song, and that as a theologian, it would be falling short if, say, I'm going to study the other text of the other tradition only insofar as the ideas are there, but I'll never let it touch my heart, or I'll never get involved in it. No, you have to keep going with it. But then reading together creates a kind of unsettling dynamic about, well, where is God hiding in these two traditions? So those are the kinds of things I've been doing, comparative and theologically. The lecture I gave at St. Andrews the other day Mario Aguilar, I'm sure many of you know, had a kind of interfaith year and had a very wonderful document signing on Friday, kind of looking for common ground of people of different traditions committed to working together. But he asked me to, the follow-up conference was like on silence and study in the exchange of religions. And Mario, at this point in his life, is very interested in silence in the Indian traditions, the work of Raimondo Panikkar, the ashram movement in India, and so on. And I think being a Jesuit and therefore being somewhat deliberately contrary, I want to talk about silence and word in the engagement of traditions. That silence by itself would become empty and dull. Words by themselves can be very vapid. And therefore, how do you kind of find a way to go back and forth between silence and listening and putting into words the things that you believe? And that both of those are places for interreligious learning. But the comparative part of it was that I tried to move back and forth between Hindu and Christian examples throughout the talk. And that basically never saying that they're talking about the same thing, but rather saying the issue of why silence, why should the silence end, what is God like that God can hide, but also that God speaks to us across the traditions, basically trying to theologize out of the two traditions without making a big thing out of it. Rather than just saying, I'm a Christian and I'll quote a Hindu text over here, but rather to flow back and forth, even though there's a Christian starting point and Christian ending point. The final thing I'll talk about and then turn over to my respondent or discussant, I've been finishing a book related to a lecture series I gave in India last year. It's called the Teep Lectures, or the Westcott Teep Lectures, out of Cambridge in the UK. Basically, Bishop Westcott was a Oxford professor, did his work on New Testament, for which he's famous, was a bishop of Durham, I think, after that, but was also one of the founders of the Anglican mission to India, and therefore of St. Stephen's College in Delhi, which is one of the great colleges of India. And he had this vision that we need to go to India, build a Christian culture, build a great Christian institution in India, so that in Indian Christianity will grow up, so that they can come back and save us in the UK. Because he thought in 1900 that Anglicans were losing their grasp and were becoming too secularized and didn't really believe and were just going through the motions, etc. We needed somewhere else to give us back the grounding in the faith, and he believed India could do that. So his disciple, William Teep, was so enthused by this that he gave money for an ongoing lecture series since about 1950 to honor this idea of the back and forth. So I gave the lectures last year on the future of Hindu-Christian understanding, a large topic indeed, which has tortured me ever since as I try to turn it now into a book without turning it into an encyclopedia. But part of my analysis, and I'll try to do this very briefly, in the book was to say, over the past 500 years, there's been a lot of exchange between Hindus and Christians. Even before 1500 or so, when the Portuguese appeared, there were the Kerala Christians, the Martoma Christians, the Syrian Rite Christians in Kerala. But we have less information or literature about that period. But over the past 500 years, lots of back and forth, and the Jesuits of my Jesuit order were often leaders in the Christian study of Hinduism. Back to Francis Xavier, who wrote letters, the first Jesuit in India, 1542, wrote letters back to Europe about what he was seeing in India before he went to Japan and tried to go to China. Then Robert de Nobili, who dressed like a Hindu sannyasi, Thomas Stevens, who did a first translation of the gospel, or did a life of Christ in the Malayalam language. All these figures, particularly of the 17th, 18th century, were energetically involved in the study of Hinduism. This revived in the late 19th and 20th century, and yet it seemed to be, to some extent, fragile and got pushed aside by new currents such as Dalit theology, liberation theology in India, and did not seem to make a great impression on Hindus. They liked these Jesuits, they appreciated them, but it didn't change the way the Hindus thought. It said, okay, you're not attacking us anymore, that's good, but we're not going to read your work that much because We don't need you to tell us about our tradition. So there's something about the lack of the reciprocity in the Jesuit tradition, which I think is one of the great learning traditions. Another lecture was about how Hindus have studied the West. And it's disappointing to see Hindus have not expressed great interest in Christian theology, but Western thought they've had great interest in. And so particularly on a philosophical engagement, back to figures like Kant and Hegel, Hume, Berkeley, and so on, and then up to 20th century figures, the analytic philosophers, Bertrand Russell, and then people like Heidegger and so on. A lot of Indian efforts, primarily by, not necessarily by, but in fact primarily by Hindu thinkers, learning from the West and engaging it and trying to link it to Hindu traditions of learning. And I think to some extent we need to learn more from that intellectual effort, because if you're looking only for theology, you kind of miss it. But learning from that philosophical engagement, but also be able to point out that something was lost by these great Indian intellectuals not particularly engaging Western theology. So not reading Augustine and Aquinas, but reading Kant and Hegel. That there was a lack of kind of symmetry in the interest and the starting points. And in the third lecture, I talk about how the modern study of religion in the West, places like here, Oxford, Cambridge, places in the US, is changing the way academically in today's world we think about Hinduism, how we think about Christianity, and how we think about comparative religion and so on. And that instead of continuing simply to play out Christians and Hindus in India, realize that both of these are genuinely global traditions, and that the resources of the modern study of religion in the West, if done in a way that's sympathetic to theology, actually could change the way Hindus and Christians study each other. But the point of all this is to say that in the last chapter, which was not a lecture but kind of an add-on, I argue that of the ways one might think of opening the door to a more symmetrical, even Hindu-Christian learning, that comparative theology is actually a good model. That because it's a grounding in faith that is genuinely intellectually curious and seeking truth without respect for borders between traditions, and also honors the differences among traditions, it seems to me that this is a kind of study that could replace older models that were one-sided, or older models that preferred philosophy to theology, and say, well, here's a theological model that allows the Hindu to be Hindu, the Christian to be Christian, and to create a space for interreligious learning between the two traditions. Part of the claim I'm making, too, is that if it's not theological, it doesn't work. So if you don't have people on both sides of the conversation being willing to talk about why their faith is engaging the other, it can slip into historical study, philosophy, study of religion or something, and what people like me hope for will not take place. But rather, I guess the point of that is to say that while comparative theology is a discipline within Christian theology, I think it can be done from other religious perspectives, and also can create a good place where kind of this cross-learning can take place between traditions. The last thing I'll say as I finish and as my voice gives out is that I've been talking Hindu-Christian. And if you are in a different field of study, you may think of 1,000 things where the chemistry and the balance is different. So if you're in Jewish Christian, or Muslim Christian, or Chinese Christian, the dynamics of how the traditions have a history together, how they relate to one another, what the Christian theological dispositions toward the other are going to be different. I've always found that Hinduism, we've had lots of contact, but not an overwhelming amount of contact, and that Hinduism creates an infinite number of possibilities for imaginative exchange. And I wouldn't say that necessarily Judaism or Islam would have the same range of possibilities. So I think what I'm doing works pretty well with Hindu-Christian, but you might rightly say, well, if you're doing Islam, I don't see how you could do it that way, or if I'm doing Judaism, how you could do it that way. So I hope I've opened up a number of things for us to talk about, and then I think John is my respondent, so thank you.